always realized that an athlete should never stay around too long. And I saw certain athletes that did stay around too long, and it really tarnished their legacy. White supremacy says that for you to be considered a person I respect and like, you must accept the fact that I can validate you.
He was both the king of the NFL and the first black movie star to conquer Hollywood. Jim Brown, the man once hailed as the most perfect American and the pride of black America. But when the spotlight faded, another man emerged, fiery, violent, and full of darkness. They called him America's hero, the god of the gridiron, but the police called him a woman beater. He once said, "I'd rather go to jail than let them say I need help." Then at the height of his fame, Jim Brown suddenly walked away. His name vanished from the football field and Hollywood stopped mentioning him. Why? What was Jim Brown running from? This is not just the story of an athlete. It is the tragedy of a black legend carrying too much darkness to ever be forgiven. The first anger of a Georgia child. Winter 1936. On St. Simon's Island, Georgia, a black baby was born in a rundown wooden shack. They named him James Nathaniel Brown. His father, Swinton Brown, was an amateur boxer, but he disappeared when Jim was only 2 years old. His mother, Teresa, worked as a maid for white families around the island, trading every penny she could to feed her son. He grew up in poverty, but what hurt more than hunger was the way people looked at him. In Georgia in the 1940s, black people were not allowed to look white people in the eye, sit at the same table, drink from the same water fountain, or raise their heads when speaking. Any black child who dared to talk back to a white person could disappear overnight, and no one would ask questions. When Jim was 8, his mother Teresa left the island to work in Long Island, New York. A year later, Jim was brought north to reunite with her. At Manhasset High School, the world seemed wider, but prejudice never went away. He was the only black student on the entire athletic team. On his first day in the locker room, the whole team went silent. A white player whispered, "If that guy touches the ball, I'm quitting." The coach didn't defend him. He simply said, "Prove yourself on the field." And Jim did. Jim Brown competed in 5 sports at once: football, lacrosse, basketball, baseball, and track, and broke records in all of them. He scored 38 points in a basketball game, outran every white athlete on the track, and always delivered the winning play in the championship game. But glory wasn't all there was. At school, Jim was still placed at the back of the classroom, denied entry to some clubs because of rules for white students only. He saw the difference every day, how white students were given more chances. And that was the first spark of anger, slow and quiet, that would burn inside Jim Brown for the rest of his life. The road to the NFL, when anger became strength. In the fall of 1953, 18-year-old Jim Brown entered Syracuse University. From the very first days, he realized Syracuse was not welcoming him. He was the only black player on the football team, and the only one forced to live in the rundown dormitory not meant for athletes. At mealtimes, he often sat alone because many teammates refused to sit with him. He was warned not to date white women and was pushed to a backup position. But this time, he didn't fight back with words. He fought back with action. Jim Brown trained so hard that one teammate said, if the devil ever had a body, he'd run like Jim Brown. In 1956, his final chance came. Syracuse finally gave him the starting position at running back. And in just one season, Jim Brown shattered the school's scoring record with 43 points in a single game, something no one had ever done before. He led the team in rushing yards, average yards per carry, touchdowns, and was named All-American. The New York Times wrote, "Jim Brown doesn't run, he attacks. No one can stop him." In early 1957, the Cleveland Browns selected him in the 6th round of the NFL draft. From his rookie season, Jim Brown stunned the entire league. He led the NFL with 942 rushing yards and was named Rookie of the Year. Even more remarkable, he became the first black player in history to be seen as the face of the league. What made Jim Brown different wasn't just his strength, it was the fury he kept inside. His eyes were always cold, as if every game were a personal war of revenge. In 1964, he led the Cleveland Browns to their first NFL championship in nearly a decade. The whole nation cheered his name, but Jim Brown didn't smile. He was the first player in NFL history to win 3 MVP awards, 1957, 1958, 1965, a rare feat that proved his absolute dominance during his era. A reporter once asked, "How does it feel to be the greatest football player in America?" Jim replied quietly, "I never wanted to be a legend. I just don't want anyone controlling me anymore." No one knew that sentence would become a prophecy for his fateful turn in 1966. The Dirty Dozen, the reckless move that shocked America, the price of freedom. In 1965, after completing his 9th season with the Cleveland Browns, Hollywood began to take notice of Jim Brown. During the 1960s, American cinema was hungry for something new. The era of polished white heroes like John Wayne was fading. Hollywood wanted a new kind of man, raw, powerful, real. And Jim Brown, with his sculpted body, stoic face, and eyes full of fire, was exactly the new face they were looking for. Director Robert Aldrich preparing for his war epic. The Dirty Dozen happened to catch Jim Brown on a sports talk show. He was captivated by the way Brown spoke, slow, confident, never bowing to anyone. Aldrich turned to his assistant and said, "I want that man in my movie. Not because he's an athlete, but because he's power incarnate." The invitation was sent, and Jim Brown, who had never studied acting, accepted immediately. Not for money, but because it was his chance to break free from the constraints the NFL had placed on him. But the price of that freedom was his entire sports career. Summer 1966. London was sweltering thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat on the set of The Dirty Dozen. Jim Brown, the greatest football player on the planet, now wore an American soldier's uniform, not for war, but for film. In the middle of shooting, an assistant rushed up to him, pale-faced, clutching a telegram from the U.S. "If you do not report to training camp, the Cleveland Browns will fine you $1,500 per day and may suspend your contract." Jim Brown said nothing. The entire crew watched him. He folded the paper, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and continued the next scene in silence. Across the ocean, Brown's owner Art Modell was waiting. He didn't believe Jim would actually quit. No one walked away from the NFL at their peak. But weeks later, while the press was still counting the days until Brown's return, a handwritten letter arrived in Cleveland. "I've achieved what I wanted. Now I want to live my life my own way. I officially retire." The nation exploded. Newspapers screamed, "Jim Brown walks away" from glory television debates raged for days. Commentators called it the most shocking decision in sports history. At 30 years old, Jim Brown left the NFL as its undisputed king. He had led the league in rushing yards in 8 of 9 seasons, won 3 MVP titles, and never missed a single game due to injury. No one in history had ever walked away at their peak. But Jim Brown didn't leave for fame or for Hollywood. He left for freedom. Throughout his NFL years, even as its biggest star, he was treated with disrespect. White team owners decided when he practiced what he said, whether he could act in movies, even how he smiled for the camera. "I don't belong to any owner," he said coldly. "I belong to myself." To many Americans, that decision was a slap in the face. A black athlete daring to defy the system, to choose freedom over obedience. They called him a traitor to his team, to his fans. But for Jim Brown, it was the first time in his life he could finally breathe. On the set of The Dirty Dozen, director Robert Aldrich later recalled, "He stood there in the dust and smoke sweat soaking through his shirt, and I realized I was looking at a man who had just killed his past." MGM paid Jim Brown $60,000 for his role, more than many white supporting actors, a massive sum at the time equivalent to nearly $600,000 today. When The Dirty Dozen premiered in June 1967, it grossed over $45,000 worldwide, becoming one of the biggest box office hits of the 1960s, second only to The Graduate and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. That success transformed Jim Brown from football superstar to Hollywood's first black action hero. But no one could have predicted what came next. Because beyond the blinding lights of Hollywood lay the real darkness of Jim Brown's life. Hollywood light and hell. After The Dirty Dozen, Jim Brown's phone never stopped ringing. Columbia, MGM, Paramount. Everyone wanted the name Brown on their posters. He signed his second film, The Split 1968, for a paycheck of $100,000, double what he earned the year before, nearly $1,000 today. Jim became the highest-paid black actor of his time. Behind the scenes, people called him the Black Superman of Hollywood. But the peak came in 1969, when Brown starred alongside Raquel Welch in 100 Rifles, a Mexican-set action blockbuster. Raquel Welch was America's ultimate sex symbol. And in just one scene, 7 seconds, one kiss, Jim Brown rewrote Hollywood history. A black man and a white woman kissed on screen at a time when theaters in the American South still hung signs reading "Whites Only." Cinemas in Texas, Alabama, and Mississippi refused to screen the film. Far-right politicians demanded that Jim Brown be banned from the screen forever. But on the other side, black magazines like Ebony and Jet celebrated him as the man who broke the final chains of American cinema. For Black America, that moment was a victory for an entire people. Raquel Welch later recalled, "Before we rolled the cameras, Jim said, 'They're going to hate us, but they have to learn to live with it.'" That scene made him the first true symbol of freedom for black actors in Hollywood, and also marked the beginning of the darkest, most destructive years of his life. Jim Brown plunged into a world of parties, whiskey, and sleepless nights. Hollywood in the 1970s was the capital of excess, and Jim Brown was its new king. Whiskey, cocaine, funk music, and mansions that never slept. Jim Brown, 6'2", sculpted like a statue with a deep, gravelly voice, walked into every room like a god. He bought a mansion in the Hollywood Hills with Rolls-Royces filling the garage. He partied all night with Muhammad Ali, Sammy Davis Jr., and Richard Pryor. Women lined up outside the gate. Men wanted to be him, and women wanted to belong to him. But behind the smile and the glasses of liquor was the same old anger that never went away. Brown was addicted to control. He needed to dominate. He had to be the strongest man in the room. He became reckless, short-tempered, and obsessed with power. A friend once said Jim didn't know how to love gently. He loved like he was fighting. From 1968 to 1999, Jim Brown's name appeared not only on movie posters but also in countless police reports. The title, Hollywood's first black action hero, slowly turned into a serial abuser. Scandals and shadows. The Holy War. Inside his home. The first crack. In the summer of 1968, Los Angeles police received an emergency call from Jim Brown's mansion. When they arrived, Ava Bon Chin, his girlfriend, was found lying motionless beneath a second-floor balcony, her body covered in bruises. Jim was handcuffed and taken to the station charged with assault, but Eva refused to testify. The case was closed. No evidence, no conviction. But the image of the black hero began to fracture. From that day on, whispers followed him for the rest of his life. People began to fear him, even those who once loved him. Accusations and truth. When a hero turns into a villain. By the 1980s, as the women's rights movement gained momentum, old wounds began to resurface. In 1985, a model accused Jim of beating her in a jealous rage. 4 years later, in 1989, another woman claimed he had assaulted and held her captive for hours inside his Hollywood Hills home. Both cases lacked witnesses, and once again, Jim walked free. His fame saved him again. The final explosion, June 18, 1999. Los Angeles once again echoed the name Jim Brown. According to police records, his wife, 25-year-old Monique Brown, reported that her husband had flown into a rage and smashed her Lexus with a shovel. When officers arrived, Brown was waiting at the door, his deep voice calm, his eyes cold as steel. "I didn't hurt anyone. I just taught her a lesson." That sentence sent chills through America. The man once admired for his pride was now using that same pride to justify violence. The court charged him with vandalism and property destruction. He was sentenced to 1 year of anger management and probation, but Jim Brown refused. In court, he said, "I'd rather go to jail than let them say I need treatment." It was a short sentence, but it closed the final door of his career. No one saw a hero anymore, only a man who refused to bow even when life had already beaten him. In February 2000, Jim Brown, 64, was sentenced to 6 months in jail for refusing to attend domestic violence counseling. The NFL legend, Hollywood's first black action star, once hailed as the greatest American, now wore an orange jumpsuit, standing among men who once called him an idol. American media reported Jim Brown from the field to the screen, and finally to a cell. Brown had been arrested at least 7 times on assault-related charges, most of them involving women. From that day, he disappeared from Hollywood. No more roles, no endorsements, no mentions. Studios removed his name from their lists. Magazines that once glorified him fell silent as if he had never existed. It was Jim Brown's second disappearance. The first time he left the NFL in search of freedom. This time he left the world to escape himself. In prison, Brown wrote to a friend, "I'm not afraid of jail. I'm afraid of having nothing left to fight for." A man who once conquered all of America ultimately lost to his own heart, because the only enemy Jim Brown could never defeat was the same anger that had made him a legend. But Jim Brown was not only a legend on the field or a dazzling star on the screen. He was also a fearless warrior in the fight for human rights, a man who turned his fame into a weapon for justice. The fight for Black America, the Cleveland Summit. The 1960s in America were like a pressure cooker. The Vietnam War raged on the civil rights movement spread, and Black Americans began to rise up, refusing to bow to the system any longer. Amid that storm, Jim Brown, the NFL superstar, and Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, emerged as two symbols of Black strength. Both men shared the same spirit, confidence, defiance, and a refusal to bow to white power. On June 4, 1967 in Cleveland, a defining moment took place. When Ali announced he would refuse to be drafted for the Vietnam War, he was stripped of his world title, banned from boxing, and faced a 5-year prison sentence. The nation turned on him. Amid the outrage, Jim Brown gathered a group of Black icons, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, Bobby Mitchell, and others for what became known as the Cleveland Summit, a historic meeting to support Ali. The photo of them seated around a table, Ali in the center, Brown beside him, their faces proud and unyielding, became a symbol of courage. Brown spoke at the press conference. He has the right to stand up for what he believes. A man cannot be called a coward for saying no. That image became known as the Black Power Table, one of the most powerful photographs in the history of America's civil rights movement. After that, Ali and Brown remained close friends for decades. They appeared together at social events, speeches, and youth outreach programs. Both believed that a Black man must take charge of his own destiny and never wait for anyone to save him. When Ali passed away in 2016, Jim Brown was one of the men who helped carry his casket. The two had changed how America saw itself. And though the world once knew Jim Brown as an invincible legend in his private life, he was a man defeated in love and marriage, and within his own home. Marriage and the tumultuous private life of Jim Brown. Sue Brown, the first wife in 1959. When the NFL hailed Jim Brown as the most complete athlete in America, he married Sue Brown, a gentle yet strong woman of Jamaican descent. They had 3 children together, Kim, Kevin, and James Jr. To the public, they were the picture-perfect family, the dream home, the hero father, the symbol of Black excellence. But behind closed doors, the cracks began to show. The anger, the silent nights, the disappearances, small fractures that slowly turned into an abyss. In 1972, they divorced quietly without tears for the cameras. Sue left with their 3 children. Jim was left with a rage he would never escape. Years later, his eldest daughter said, "My father always told us to be strong, but sometimes I just wished he knew how to be gentle." Diane Stanley, the woman between two worlds. In the mid-1970s, Jim met Diane Stanley, a young actress with a warm smile and sad eyes. They got engaged and lived through Hollywood's most glamorous years. She was one of the few people who could make Jim laugh for real. But the past never let go. The anger, the need to control, the loneliness, they all came back. Diane left before the wedding ever happened. In an interview years later, she said only one line: Jim always had to win, even in love. Monique, the last woman who stayed. Then came Monique Jones, a young model 33 years his junior. They married in 1997. 2 years later came the infamous shovel incident, which nearly ended their marriage. But Monique stayed. She waited outside the courthouse when Jim was released from jail and whispered when asked why I don't love the legend. I love the man who's trying to make things right. They had 2 children, Eris and Jim Brown too. Monique would later become the CEO of the Amer Icon Foundation, carrying on her husband's mission. Many said that without Monique, the world might never have seen the better side of Jim Brown. After the darkness, the man who found his purpose again. After years of prison and silence, Jim Brown returned not as a star, but as a man searching for meaning in his life. In 1988, he founded the Amer Icon Foundation, an educational program for prisoners, gang members, and people trying to rebuild their lives. From Los Angeles to Chicago, from Cleveland to Baltimore, Brown walked into prisons, ghettos, and schools, places where light rarely reached. He would sit across from young Black men with scarred faces and speak in a voice rough and steady as iron. If I can make it, you can too. They didn't look at him as a legend, but as someone who had fallen and gotten back up. He didn't preach. He told the truth, and that's why they believed him. For years, he continued to give speeches, raise funds, and use his own painful past to warn the next generation. He didn't hide from his mistakes, nor did he glorify them. He simply said, I lost everything because of my anger. Don't let it take your life away. But as always, Jim Brown's path was never predictable. Controversy in his final years. At 80, when most of his peers had long stepped out of the spotlight, Jim Brown once again walked into it, and this time he shocked the nation. In 2016, as America was deeply divided by the presidential election, Brown publicly announced his support for Donald Trump, a man most of the black community viewed as the very opposite of everything Brown had once stood for. He didn't just speak, he went to the White House, sat beside Trump and Kanye West, and discussed programs for the rehabilitation of black prisoners. The black community erupted in outrage. Many called it betrayal. But Jim Brown just smiled and said calmly, "I don't do politics, I do people. If he's willing to help, I'll stand with him." Critics labeled him a traitor to Martin Luther King's legacy. Young black activists who had once seen him as a hero asked, "You fought your whole life against the system, and now you shake hands with the man who represents it." But Brown has always stayed silent. No explanations, no apologies. In a later interview, he smirked and said, "I used to be hated by white folks because I was black. Now I'm hated by black folks because I don't hate white people. They're both wrong. I just do what I believe is right." That was the philosophy that guided his entire life. Jim Brown never belonged to any side, not to politics, not to parties, not to systems. All his life he believed in one simple truth, that a man's dignity lies in standing tall, even when it makes the world uncomfortable. Jim Brown lived like a warrior, and he earned his fortune like one through strength, will, and an unshakable belief that no one could ever own him. The fortune of Jim Brown, money, power, and the price of a legend. When Jim Brown passed away in 2023, Celebrity Net Worth estimated his fortune at around $30 million. But that number only told part of the story. Behind it was a complex journey of wealth, one built on glory, scandal, and choices that stunned both Hollywood and the NFL. In 1965, during his final NFL season, Brown earned $60,000 a year, on par with top movie stars at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $600,000 today. What made him different was that he didn't waste his money like many of his peers. He invested early in real estate and stocks, studied finance books, and lived by one rule: I will never let anyone decide my money for me, not even the NFL. By the time he left the field at age 30, he had saved nearly $500,000, worth more than $5 million today. Soon after, he became the highest-paid black actor in America in the late 1960s, with salaries surpassing $200,000 per film, equivalent to over $2 million today, thanks to his box office success. Brown knew fame wouldn't last forever. By the early 1970s, he began investing in real estate across Los Angeles, Cleveland, and New York. He owned a Beverly Hills mansion purchased around 1995, valued at more than $6 million, described by magazines as the quietest house on the loudest hill in America. He also owned 2 rental properties in Los Angeles County, each estimated between $1 million and $1.5 million, and a small apartment in Cleveland, which he kept. He said, "So I'll never forget where I started." Brown was never one to flaunt his wealth. "A house isn't for showing off," he once said. "It's for hiding." It was real estate that gave him a steady income long after Hollywood and the NFL had turned their backs on him. Beyond acting, Brown ventured into small business and sports ventures. He co-owned a sports marketing company, invested in a fitness equipment brand, and held a small ownership stake in the Harlem Globetrotters basketball franchise in the early 1980s. Perhaps most important was the Amor I Can Foundation, founded in 1988. Though not a profit-driven enterprise, Brown poured several $1 million of his own money into keeping its educational programs alive for ex-convicts and gang-affiliated youth. By 2023, the foundation was still active with chapters in more than 20 U.S. cities. His share in Amor I Can was valued between $3,000 and $5,000 by financial experts. Among his personal assets were several priceless items: his original 1964 helmet engraved with number 32, insured for $250,000. His 1964 NFL championship ring, valued at over $150,000. The original Dirty Dozen script, signed by Lee Marvin, worth an estimated $100,000. And a framed photo of the 1967 Cleveland Summit, signed by Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a keepsake he refused to sell even after being offered more than $500,000. To him, these weren't trophies. They were reminders of everything he had gained and everything he had lost. $30 million may seem modest compared to modern athletes, but in Jim Brown's time, it was extraordinary, especially for a black man born into poverty in 1930s America. Illness, death, and funeral. When the fire went out in silence, it wasn't a dramatic death. No accident, no public tragedy. Jim Brown, The man who once terrified America with his strength and fury passed quietly like a flame dimming on its own inside his peaceful Beverly Hills home on a May afternoon in 2023. He was 87. For nearly a decade before his death, Brown had rarely appeared in public. Friends said he walked slower, forgot more often, and needed a few seconds to steady himself every time he stood up. The news was announced by his wife Monique on Instagram. That evening, Jim passed away peacefully at our home in Los Angeles. To the world, he was a legend. To our family, he was a husband, a father, and a grandfather, and we loved him deeply. The funeral took place a week later, private and intimate. Only close family, old teammates, and a few young men from the Amer I Can Foundation, those Jim had once helped rescue from the streets. Outside fans quietly placed flowers around the bronze statue of Jim Brown outside the Cleveland Browns Stadium. News of his death rippled across America. LeBron James wrote, "We lost a hero today. My generation and I are standing on his shoulders." Barack Obama shared Jim Brown was one of the greatest players of all time, but what made him truly great was how he used his fame to fight for justice. From the NFL to Hollywood, from athletes to politicians, thousands of tributes poured in. But perhaps the most moving farewell came from his first team. The Cleveland Browns' Jim Brown is our legend, our game's legend, and America's legend. No one ever did it like him, and no one ever will. His death marked not just the end of a sports icon, but the close of an era, a time of men who refused to kneel, who dared to rage, to fall, and to rise again. Legacy. Hero or sinner Jim Brown stood as a symbol of three-world sports cinema and black empowerment. He made America look up a black man at the top of a nation still shackled by prejudice. On the field, he was a myth. On screen, a trailblazer. In society, a voice of pride and defiance. But Jim Brown was also his own darkness. His anger, his pride, and his loneliness made him a living paradox. He fought for equality, yet was condemned for violence. He broke every boundary, yet in the end imprisoned himself in silence. When people stand before Jim Brown's bronze statue outside Cleveland's stadium, they see more than an athlete. They see an entire century of dreams of hope and of human imperfection.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.